Hello everyone, you are very welcome to this presentation on the research paper titled Teachers' Perspectives on Supporting Social Communication Competency for Autistic Students Through Evidence-Based Practices. My name is Maria Dervan. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Education, Psychology, Inclusive and Special Education in Mary Immaculate College, Limerick in Ireland, and my supervisors are Professor Emma Ring and Dr. Margaret Egan. Throughout this presentation, I will be referring and using identity-first language, and this is to reflect the wishes and desires of the autistic community themselves. So this study looks at teachers' perspectives on effective evidence-based practices used to develop social communication competency for autistic children in early years Irish primary classrooms. The central research embedded questions in this study are: what are the effective evidence-based practices teachers find effective to develop social communication competency for autistic children? How are the evidence-based practices implemented in schools? How do teachers measure the effectiveness of these evidence-based practices, and what are the benefits and challenges of using effective evidence-based practices to teach social communication competency to autistic children? The study is grounded firmly in a theoretical framework, and the theoretical framework is Vygotsky's sociocultural theory. Within that theoretical framework, the main components that are highlighted are social interaction, which causes cognitive development, and this is co-constructed knowledge that happens between people before internalization. The focus on language that shapes cognitive development, and the cultural influences that cause cognitive development around a child. These cannot be separated from the person. It's the values and the tools and the resources around them that support their learning. The key ideas then that arrived from these main components are that development happens through scaffolding from a more knowledgeable other, and this was really key to this study. These more knowledgeable others are the pupils, the teachers and the families, the peers, etc. around that support the child. The zone of proximal development is the area between what a child can achieve with and without support of scaffolding. And cognitive tools support children's developing mental abilities. So these key ideas were used to frame the analysis of the results that came from this study. So when we look at it, everything in the study was pinned in literature. And identifying a gap, research states that in Ireland, pupils with the greatest needs should be supported by teachers who have relevant expertise and who can provide continuity of support. And that comes from the guidelines from our Department of Education that are governing the school rules. In the field of education research and special education, the importance of adopting evidence-based practices is the cornerstone of education for autistic students, from Egan et al. 2018. We know communication-focused interventions can lead to increases in communication, joint attention and play skills for autistic students. However, evidence-based practices specifically targeting the social communication of young autistic students are seldom implemented. There is a lack of involvement of teaching professionals in the research related to practices for autistic students. And excellent practices, if appropriately documented, would provide a guide for new teachers and a support for those in the school new to working with autistic students. So the study then had to be grounded in evidence. So it began with a systematic literature review. The systematic literature review looked at social communication competency interventions that could be used to support students. Results from the systematic review highlight that there is a lack of studies available that have medium and high quality ratings sourced in schools and featured in different reports that it's a recommendation that should be addressed. Evidence-based practices were deemed the basis on which teachers must design educational programs for autistic students. The effective evidence-based practices noted in the review included modelling and direct instruction, peer-mediated interventions, prompting, naturalistic interventions, power card strategy, pivotal response treatment, multiple strategy, social skills, training groups, social stories, and video modelling. The review highlighted that providing relevant information and training to teachers in a school setting serves to provide the best opportunity for social communication competency interventions for autistic children, and the educational setting of the school offers unique opportunities to teach autistic children social communication skills with their typically developing peers who can learn to become sensitive and helpful towards each other. So, taking on board the recommendations from the systematic literature review, as well as international literature relating to evidence-based practices to support social communication in autistic children, a quantitative data collection phase was engaged with. In this phase, survey research design featured a cross-sectional survey of teachers and adopted purposes sampling. There was data analysis then, and this was over two phases: descriptive statistics and inferential statistics. So the survey was a cross-sectional research questionnaire designed to capture the attitudes and perspectives of teachers nationally across Ireland. And there were different layers placed on the survey in order to access a purposive sample of teachers that had the necessary information to answer the questions that the survey was designing to capture. So these included, they had to be primary school teachers in Ireland. They had to be teaching 4 to 8-year-old, have experience teaching 4 to 8-year-old autistic children across Ireland. So the data collection began with the teacher surveys designed based on the results of the systematic literature review. 3,145 school principals across Ireland were emailed and teacher participants were requested from this sample. This allowed for 393 teacher responses for further analysis. So emerging data information from the survey data shows us that 75% of teachers reported having great difficulty sourcing suitable evidence-based practices to teach social communication competency. The greatest challenges to teaching social communication competency reported were being unsure of the evidence-based practices and how to implement them, and the time constraints in the classrooms across Ireland. Teachers also highlighted they felt a lack of formal assessments were available, and this was very pertinent across the data. Assessment was highlighted in numerous occasions by teachers as being a concern for them when they were implementing evidence-based practices. And 98.5% of respondents requested having specific guidelines of best practices and how to assess within these practices. When I was analysing the data, it began with 6 different steps. So in these steps, we had to prepare a codebook, use SPSS to enter the data, screen data for errors, explore the data using descriptive statistics and graphs, then modify the variables for further analysis, and conduct statistical analysis to explore the relationships. So what I just spoke to you about was the descriptive statistics, and then this filtered down into highlighting key areas for further analysis, which formed the basis for the inferential statistics. Inferential statistics then looked at the impact of the teacher's role on the adoption of the evidence-based practices, and this was evident from cross-tabulation, where the expected count, as well as the count of teachers that adopted evidence-based practices, was statistically different. And this results then indicate that more teachers than expected, especially special education teachers, employ evidence-based practices to support social communication for autistic children, which was a very interesting finding. Descriptive analysis provided evidence of the relationship between school setting and the adoption of evidence-based practices to teach social communication competency. When we drilled into that, it was interesting to note that the highest percentage of teachers felt that a combination of both the classroom set and settings outside of the school was the most effective way to use evidence-based practices to support social communication competency in autistic children. Further to that, then, the next highest percentage of teachers, it was 31.5% of the sample, saw greater merit in settings outside of the school classroom that would be more beneficial to support social communication competency development for children. Chi-square results indicate we accept the null hypothesis. There's no association between teachers' adoption of evidence-based practices and the use of assessment to measure evidence-based practices. So descriptive statistics detail that 74.8% of teacher respondents that use evidence-based practices do not actually assess and measure their effectiveness. So there was a real disparity there. 19.2% of teachers across all evidence-based practices cited that lack of knowledge was the reason for not using them or assessing them, and that 3.8% of teachers reported not adopting evidence-based practices that were targeted specifically to autistic children's needs. So there was a disparity among how teachers were using the evidence-based practices and what was emerging in the data. So further analysis needs to be done, but thank you very much for engaging in this presentation, and the research paper has more detail.